Okay, go ahead and keep typing. I'm getting a really interesting array of ideas, of thoughts, from characteristics such as being highly motivated, eager to learn, talkative, active, sponges, always connected to some kind of phone or tech. And also some of you saying that they're a little bit rebellious, sometimes bored, sometimes complicated. And I think all of those probably are accurate. The words that I would have chosen are the ones on the screen right now. Clearly active, and that's one that many of you noticed. Curious, creative, really willing to try new things, very much risk takers, and also having a lot of fun. I think some of you talked about them being enthusiastic and challenging, and we are going to talk a little bit about that as well, because being a teenager is kind of a difficult time of life. Let's talk a little bit about that. I want you to imagine that you're a teenager. I want you to think about your place in the worlds in which you inhabit. And here I think are some of the things that came out in your comments. It's a challenging time, but it's also an incredibly exciting time. It's a time for trying out new roles and activities, for finding out who you are and your places in your world, finding out what you're good at and what you love doing, becoming more independent, spreading your wings, making decisions about yourself, learning to take risks and solve problems much better than when you were much younger. And then here I think is where it gets to be a little more complicated, feeling sometimes like an adult and sometimes like a child, but always asking, who am I? Always trying to figure out their own identity and also trying to shape your future. These are the teenagers that we're going to be talking about, and with a variety of projects that we can actually use with them. I'd like to do another poll, and I want to think now about activities that you think teens do not like to do in class. Many of you said they're challenging and they're boring. What are the kinds of activities they don't like to do, which maybe is one of the reasons that they are challenging and often bored? Take a few minutes to type in the chat room. Okay, here are some of the things that you said and some of the things that I've noticed. Many of you mentioned they don't like to focus on grammar. They don't like to read long passages. I think probably they don't like to read things that they aren't interested in. And unfortunately, too many times we're asking them to read things that are really quite boring, that have no relevance to their own lives, that are not meaningful or from their perspective are purposeful. They certainly don't like to be told to be quiet and stop talking. And unfortunately, we often do that for classroom management. But one of the nice things about projects is actually they'll have an opportunity to do that. They don't want to be passive. They don't want to be asked, never be asked about their opinions or about what they know about a topic. And they certainly do not want to be prevented from using their mobile phones or other technology. Many of you said that they are really actually practically tied to their tech. They don't like tests, as many of you said. They don't like to have to do a lot of writing unless it's creative writing. And they actually don't like to sit still while others are finishing. They want to be active and involved. Now let's compare this with project work. Instead of memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules, they're using them. Instead of being told to be quiet, they can work together, they can collaborate on a project, they can help each other, and they can talk. Instead of being passive, they can be active and they can use their technology to provide the information that they need for their projects. Instead of not being asked what they know or their opinions, they can share these while they're doing the project. And they can work until they finish. If they're done early, they can share their project with others who are also done, or they can help others. And so I think if many of the things that we find that don't work with teens, we're going to find that in fact they actually will like working on projects for a variety of these reasons. What do teens like? What kinds of activities? Well, these are the things I think and that Carol Reed has suggested. They like activities that are meaningful, that are related to their lives, to what they already know. They like activities that are purposeful, that language is used to do things, to have real or relevant outcomes. They like activities that are enjoyable. A couple of you mentioned fun. Activities that arouse their curiosity, that spark their interest, and very important, activities that lead to success, not activities where they find themselves becoming or being a failure. Activities that are supported so that no matter what their English language proficiency level, they have an opportunity to interact and to make meaningful language by using as well visuals, actions, gestures, help, and they certainly like praise. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of not correcting their grammar, their pronunciation, their vocabulary when they're actually engaged in working on a project, and how we might be able to provide the support that we need. They also like activities that are social. Teens are very much social. They want to communicate with others, with their peers. They want to work together or collaborate. They want to be in a classroom which has a sense of community. And one of the things that's so important is, it seems to me, that projects can be all of these. Projects can provide all of these attributes or characteristics of activities that teens find meaningful and useful. Confucius said, I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. Compare that now with the kinds of activities we've been talking about that our teens like and the ones that they don't like, and particularly think about projects. I think actually Ben Franklin, who was one of the founding fathers of the US, one of the first postmaster generals, said it even better. He said, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. And it's that last line, involve me and I learn. Projects are all involving and provide a number of ways in which learners can learn about the world as well as they can learn language. So what are projects? Well, projects are experiential learning. Learning through projects is experience. And projects, as Heider Wrigley said, is knowledge in action. John Dewey, who's one of the fathers of this project-based learning, said, education is not a preparation for life. Education is life itself. Projects bring life itself into the classroom, and they provide motivating opportunities for learning. So what makes projects so engaging? Well, here are some of the reasons, I think. Learners get to use their imagination. They think of themselves in different places, different roles, different jobs. They can imagine themselves in a variety of roles as they're really exploring their identity and who they are. They can invent things and solve problems. They can create things, brochures, videos, advertisements, comic strips. And as we go through some of the projects, you'll see that the list is really quite endless. They can do their own research and demonstrate what they've learned. They can write and talk about themselves, their challenges and interests, and they can share their ideas and work with peers. So here's another poll. What are some successful projects that you've asked your students to do, or projects that you've seen other teachers use? Take a few seconds and jot down some of the projects that you think have been particularly successful. Wow. As I said, the list is endless, and you had some fabulous projects that you've been noting. everything from a hotel brochure. One of you wrote that you actually had your learners create a company, videos, digital stories, debates, plays, posters, PowerPoints, animations, videos, dealing with environmental problems with science experiments, really wonderful possibilities. And we are going to be talking about the fact that our teenagers are actually 21st century learners who also are global learners. They actually need to be involved at many levels in participating as global citizens. And it sounds like some of you are already doing that in your projects. So here are some projects that I would note are successful for teens. Writing, not perhaps the kind of boring writing that many of you talked about that your learners don't like, but much more creative writing, like a class magazine or a newsletter or a Facebook page or a blog, using visuals, using photos. Surveys, reporting on surveys of things that they find interesting, and then actually creating graphs or charts or quotations, and also in the process doing some actual practice with visual literacy. Writing and performing skits, songs, raps, imagined or real interviews with singers, with actors, sports heroes, with role models. Writing a brochure, many of you mentioned brochures, tourism brochures, hotel brochures. They could write those about anything, about their favorite places, their favorite sports, the foods that they like to eat. And in fact, one of the ways to actually make this even more interesting is if they share that brochure with another class in either another city or another country, and where they get a chance to actually learn about each other's cultures, others' traditions, others' favorite sports, places, foods, and the like. One of you had designing a company. Well, another one might be to design a perfect English class or school. And then I think we need to be pretty able to take criticism, because I'm sure they're going to find some things that we're doing that maybe they think need to be changed. Writing a photo autobiography. It is so wonderful that many of our learners have cell phones that have cameras. They could actually do a variety of photos that introduces themselves, introduces their family, their friends, their pets, the things that they like to do. And they could then post those on a web page or on a poster or a Facebook page. Keeping a journal. All of these are possibilities of really what I think are successful projects for teens. The projects should also provide opportunities for teens to actually use what have been called the 21st century skills, or the 4Cs, which are critical thinking, collaboration, communication, and creativity. And if you'll see in that graphic, these things all interrelate. And in most cases, we're doing in a project, we're doing all of these, or at least 3 of them. So projects provide opportunities for teens to engage in critical thinking, to communicate their ideas, to collaborate with their peers, and to use their creativity toward a meaningful goal. And in the process, actually be developing the skills that many people have said are really critical skills for the 21st century, especially those skills that will enable people to work together in teamwork for common ends or goals that are increasingly important in terms of employment as well as education. And projects bring all of these skills together and enable our learners and our teenagers to actually use these, doing something that I hope they'll find interesting and enjoyable. So here's an example of encouraging critical thinking and creativity. This is from a variety of possible projects dealing with the virtual self. And we know that our teens are tied to their phones and their technology. They often use those tech devices for many hours a day. So why not then give them a chance to advertise either an app or a website? They can choose one, an app or a website that they use regularly. Then they have to be critical about it. They have to think about what are the best features and what are the worst features. And then they need to create an ad for the app or website and present it to the class. Notice that what's so interesting about this is they, in the process, are learning some of the ways in which people are creating ads to get us to buy things, to get us to do things. They become then much more critical when they look at other people's ads, because they're going to look at ads as they're trying to develop one for either their app or their website. I'm hearing some of you are having trouble with sound. Um, any, Emily, any possibility that we're doing? Okay, I'll try to keep talking loud. I don't know what's causing the problems with sound. Okay, here's another one set of projects dealing with communication and technology. But in this one, it's actually talking about how communication has changed because of technology. And one of the activities, actually, the third one, working in groups, involves actually creating a timeline, thinking back about how communication has changed over the past 100 years, and creating a timeline showing at least 5 ways that communication has changed. Then the more interesting part, I think, is adding 2 or 3 predictions for how communication will change in the future. Another very nice one is the working by yourself. Imagine you can send a letter back in time to your great great grandparents and write a description of a smartphone. How are you going to do that so that they will understand what it is? Again, a lot of critical thinking, as well as thinking about how am I going to communicate these ideas to someone who's never seen a smartphone, and the like. Surveys are also a really good way, a good kind of project, and a way to actually use language in very meaningful ways. One of the possible surveys is to conduct a sleep survey. I think most of us know that teenagers do not get enough sleep. At least that certainly is the case in the US. So it might be a good idea to find out how much time people in your class actually sleep. And you might be able to find out why that is. Why is it that they sleep as little as they do? And then to summarize the information and present it to the class. So a sleep survey of 5 questions to 10 of your classmates. Another possible survey would be to do a survey about classmates' online activity. How many hours a day are they online, and what are they actually doing when they're online? You could conduct the survey, summarize the results, and perhaps in this case, make some recommendations. Other possibilities would be to do some interviews, real interviews, as well as some mock interviews. You might, with a partner, pick a famous person that you would like to interview and write some questions, research answers, because you probably are not going to have the students are not going to have the opportunity to actually engage in that interview. And that, however, they can role play a TV interview in which one of them asks questions of the famous person provides answers that they've actually been able to find by doing research. A real interview, that was a mock interview, a real interview might be to interview a person who's lived in your neighborhood for a long time and to ask what changes have happened, to summarize that interview, and then to find maps and photos and document the changes. So an interview with someone who is of interest because they've lived near where the learners have lived for some time. This could be done independently, but it also could be done in pairs if they live near the same person. So other kinds of interviews, interview a role model. Choose a person who's a role model for teens, write some questions to use in the interview, and they might be about the person's life, the obstacles that he or she has overcome, how he or she has pushed himself or herself, and then to conduct the interview and summarize what they've learned about the person for their classmates, and if possible, to include a photo. They could also role play a video interview with a wild animal expert and a journalist to talk about the problems that a wild animal faces. And one of our major topics for being a global citizen is to think about how the environment is changing, how sea level is rising, and how many animals and plants are endangered because of the problems that perhaps we as humans have caused. If possible, then film the interview, share it with the class, or role play the interview. It'd be kind of a fun interview to have a wild animal expert and a journalist. Another kind of creative project is any kind of an invention. And I particularly like this one about designing a robot that will do something that you don't like to do. And it's funny because a task that I don't like to do is actually to vacuum the floor. And there actually is now a robot that does that task. There's something that actually rolls around your floor, and when it hits the wall, it moves and goes back out again. Unfortunately, I can't afford one of those, but it is an excellent new invention that does do something that I don't like to do. And so I think a lot of teens can think of a lot of tasks they don't want to do. And it would be kind of a nice challenge to design a robot that would do that task, to then draw and label a picture of that robot and then explain to your classmates how it would work. So inventions are really great. Here's another kind of invention. In this case, it's taking what people like about 2 or 3 sports and now figuring out how they might create a new sport using that. So in the illustration, you see that they've combined, it looks like volleyball and bowling, which are 2 sports presumably somebody really liked. And how would you combine those? What kind of a sport might you have? And what would the rules be? It seems to me that this would be great fun. Obviously, a hybrid sport is not likely to be something that actually is created and that people play. But think about what goes into this. Thinking about these sports, figuring out ways that you might combine them, communicating your ideas to each other, and then demonstrating or explaining the sport to the class. Again, it uses all 4 of those 4 C's of the 21st century skills. Another project is one that went on for many, many years, that a colleague of mine was in charge of. What she did was she paired up classes in different cities around the world, beginning with 3 cities and ending up with 5 cities, where the students met online. They decided what they were interested in knowing about each other's cities. They decided on topics, and some of them were museums and interesting sites. And then they worked in small groups. They shared their work as they were working with others who had the same topic, for example, museums or interesting sites or sports. And then they produced tourist brochures for their cities. They chose photos, illustrations, and maps, and they wrote the text, and they shared them online, and had something which was really very, very meaningful, because it was a chance to showcase their city, but also a chance to communicate through English about that city, and also to learn about other cities where other learners like them were actually living. A very similar project, which would be much simpler, would be simply to do a walk around our neighborhood, our city, our school, to actually ask your learners as they're coming to class to take some pictures, and then to write a description of what that neighborhood looks like, or what the area around the school looks like. Very small project, but a very interesting one that is made possible by technology, and something which, as we've indicated, our learners really like. Imaginary journeys are great fun. Imagine that you're exploring an extreme environment like the Arctic or Antarctica, and write a journal entry about that journey. Describe why you're taking it, what equipment you need, and what you discover, and read your journal to the class. This is a unit that's dealing with extreme environments. But an imaginary journey could be part of a number of different topics or units. Another interesting one in a unit on outer space is to design and write a postcard from outer space. Imagine that you took a week-long journey to a place mentioned in that unit, and you write a postcard message about your trip, which is really incredibly imaginative. And then you find a photo of the place and you paste it on one side of the card, as you would with a postcard, and you put your message on the other. And so you send a postcard from outer space, an imaginary journey. Skits are also a great way to collaborate and communicate. How about write and perform a skit about a natural disaster? We all need to be prepared for things like volcanoes and earthquakes and forest fires like those that are raging right now in California. Find out what are the best ways to handle that, and write a dialogue between somebody who is a safety worker and a person that he or she is helping to prevent, to prepare for, or to react to the disaster. And so doing that, then create it and perform a skit. A very simple one, act out a word, good for vocabulary review. Give cards with action verbs to pairs of students. Make them prepare and act out their verbs for students to guess. A little bit like charade, but very much focused on the action verbs. Another small project, but one that really provides the kind of identity, concern with identity that our teens are so interested in, would be to actually do a who am I with adverbs of frequency. And in this, the learner would write 7 sentences, one each with the following words: always, usually, often, and the like. And what they would write is I always, I usually, I often, I sometimes, I occasionally, I rarely, or I never. Now that could be related to anything. It could be what they do on weekends. It could be the food that they eat. It could be what they wear. Whatever the unit is that you're working on with your students, they could actually then talk about themselves in relationship to that topic. Now, when they do this, they don't sign their name. They put it all on one sheet of paper. Somebody comes around and collects those and then passes these out to different people. They then read them aloud and everyone tries to guess who it is. A nice activity for maybe halfway through the term when people know each other, but there's an awful lot they still don't know. And here's a chance for each learner to kind of showcase something about himself or herself. Nice, simple project, but and one that doesn't take a lot of time. Pictures are often great for providing us with opportunities to have our learners write dialogue. This is from a unit about the relationship between man and non-human animals. This is an elephant keeper in Kenya who is with a baby elephant that he is taking care of. And I think it would be wonderful to actually use this as the basis of writing a dialogue. What is the elephant thinking, or what is he trying to tell that elephant keeper? And what is the elephant keeper trying to tell and do for the elephant? Great photos make wonderful opportunities for writing meaningful dialogue instead of the rote dialogue that we sometimes get in our language textbooks. In this one, I have been told that this is an actual photo, that it hasn't been photoshopped, although I find it very hard to believe that there are 6 male lions that all are getting along. But nonetheless, it's a great photo. How about writing about what they're each thinking? What are they doing there? What are they thinking about? What are they looking at? What are they hoping? Be kind of nice to have. It could be a really fun skit with people acting out each of these lions and these lions' thoughts and these lions' hopes, what it is they're doing. It's a great idea. Great photos make for great possible dialogues and projects. TED Talks are really another possible great project. Everyone loves stories. A lot of us listen to TED Talks, and really they're all stories. And most of you even begin with "so I," which leads into the story. They're pretty formulaic, and they're pretty easy to imitate. So what you might want to do is have your learners think of a story that they want to tell, talk about it with a partner, then decide on the story, write a brief story, and then video themselves telling the story and present the video to the class. This could be done at all levels of English proficiency. It doesn't have to be like a professional TED Talk. It can be very simple. Even our beginners can tell basic stories if we give them the topic and we give them some ideas of things they might say. We all like to tell stories, and little kids like to tell stories, teens do, adults do. TED Talks are a nice thing we might want to imitate even at lower levels of proficiency. And we need to keep remembering that our teens are living in a global interconnected world, and that we need to be providing them with a global perspective and helping them to become responsible global citizens and to have the kind of values that will be those that enable us as a planet, as a globe, to actually survive. I'm sorry, this happened before. We're going to try it again. Okay, global education. What is that? Well, it's anytime we learn about problems or issues that cut across national boundaries. It's about the interconnectedness of systems, our cultural systems, ecological systems, economic systems, political systems, technological systems. All of these are interconnected. And really important, to understand and appreciate people who have different cultural backgrounds from ours, to be able to see the world through other people's eyes and minds, and to realize that other people of the world need and want much the same things that we do. I think this is a very nice definition of global education. So our teens live in a very global, interconnected world, one in which, as we know, English has become the means by which, in fact, we communicate and we use that internet. I did a quick look at an internet site which keeps track of how much content is written in English, and it does it really updates it on at least a weekly basis. Right now, 53.6% of the content of the internet is written in English. So we are an interconnected world, but it's also English which enables us to be interconnected, to be able to communicate and to collaborate and to be able to actually invent things, to be able to accomplish things together. This interconnected world is a very, very complex one. We rely on each other for so many things. We rely on each other for trade, for resources, for political stability, sustainability, for protection, for innovation, for peace, communication, health, energy, aid. In fact, it's hard to think of things that we don't rely on each other for, given the fact that we are such an interconnected world, economically, politically, environmentally, and the like. So what are some topics that we would want to have some projects on that would be global in nature and that would reflect this interconnectedness of the world? Well, I think one of the most important is clearly cross-cultural understanding, to be able to understand others, other cultures, other traditions, and also to recognize how, and we also are very much alike. Protection of the environment. Right now, that's just a critical issue. Endangered species, the level of sea rise, terrible droughts in parts of the world, in places where there are horrific fires, discrimination in human rights, the elimination of hunger and poverty around the world, and then the protection of all animals, non-human as well as human. And then obviously I would hope that some of this would lead to peace. Here is a 2-semester project that was done by two professors in Japan. What they did was, the first term, students read global studies. They read about world problems. But in the second term, they actually wrote essays on a variety of global issues. And then the teacher collected these into a booklet so that these are real readings that are written at the student's English level that can be used by another class. I think this would be a really good model for you. We so often look for things that are written at the level of our students' English that engage our students, that they're things that the students want to write, want to read about. And yet it's so hard when, if we ask them to write things and we keep copies of these, we can put them into a booklet and they will have some real readings that are relevant, that are at their level, that can be used in another class. I have done this a number of times and have found actually that the things that other students have written are more interesting for our learners in many cases than the things that have been written by textbook writers. So here is a good example of global citizenship, which involves our learning to live with animals and being able to do something about the fact that so many of them are endangered. And here are a variety of projects. The first is to research an unusual wild animal that's endangered and to make posters or brochures with information about that animal, and then to share that information with your classmates. You could also have a project in which they teach others about a human-wildlife conflict. There are a number of places in which humans and animals are not interacting well. It's a problem, it's a conflict. And if there's one near you, or if there's one that you find interesting or your students find interesting, they can research what's being done to solve the problem and also perhaps what other things need to be done. And they can also create that video interview that I talked about an interview between a wild animal expert and a journalist. So global citizens are teenagers finding their places in the world. And what does that involve? Well, it involves first developing a multicultural outlook about different people, different customs, traditions, ways of life. It's also making cultural connections with their own culture as well as others. I think we often forget that people ask each other about their traditions, about their cultures, and we don't often prepare our learners to be able to talk about themselves and their own culture and their traditions, the things that they like to do. For teenagers, you would probably also want to add what I think is almost a worldwide or global teenage culture of music, of fashion, and the like. So they could actually be doing cultural connections. Global citizens also have to be able to communicate and connecting through interaction face-to-face or online, through social media and the like. Environmental connections and caring about vanishing habitat for animals and plants, less green space, pollution, misunderstood animals, and rising seawater. The seawater one is particularly one that I'm particularly concerned about. My husband was Peace Corps country director in a country of many, many islands in the Pacific. And the main island has 100,000 people on it, and the highest point in that island is 6 feet high. Already, water has actually gone over parts of the island. Already, the government is now trying to find a place where they can resettle 100,000 people. Rising seawater is really a very, very critical environmental problem that all of us need to be thinking about. And social responsibility and valuing others' lives of parents, elders, animals, and the like. Paulo Freire perhaps said it best, a very famous Brazilian educator who created literacy campaigns around the world. But the thing that he said that was so important is you can't read the word until you've actually read your world, until you figure out your place in it. Then it becomes meaningful to actually do some reading and writing. I think that's very much what I'm trying to say here about teenagers and their place in the world. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like you to think about what are some of the benefits of using projects in your classes. Take a couple minutes to chat. I know that some of you have been actually writing in your email addresses, so maybe get back onto some of the ideas of how you use projects. What are the benefits of doing that? These are some great comments. Some of the things that I'm seeing is projects engage learners, they promote collaboration, they build teamwork, they motivate learners, they interest learners. And one of you mentioned that the real important thing is that they use language for real purposes, for solving problems, boosting motivation. Very nice. Lots of really good ideas. Here are some of the things that I think are the characteristics of successful projects. They do vary a great deal in form, in language expectations, but all of them I think have the following. They have a real or authentic audience. People really want to know what it is that the project is involved in. It results in new information for learners. So learners are not just learning language, they're also learning more about the world and their place in that world. It involves an exchange of information or communication among learners, and so everybody contributes, so we get much more learning, much more information. It requires a specific product to be developed and shared in English, And here I want to make a comment. I know some of you will probably be concerned that your learners, especially if they share a language, are likely to be using that language some of the time in which they're working on their projects. I would not worry about that, because remember, when the time comes to actually produce that product and share it, they'll have to do it in English. So eventually they'll be doing speaking and writing in English. And they'll be using perhaps some of their resources of their own language as they do this. There's a lot of research now that suggests that we should be encouraging people to use their linguistic resources. If they don't have a lot of chance to use English, obviously you want to be focusing on English, but don't be too terribly concerned if sometimes they end up using some of their own language. And one of the other things, characteristic of a successful project, is to involve multiple ways of obtaining and sharing results. And note at the bottom that projects can be short or long, they can be simple or complex. They're a variety. So how do we make sure we have effective projects for teens? Well, the very first thing is to get to know your students' interests and lives so that the projects are relevant. I think one of the best things that we as teachers can do is to take the first 5 or 10 minutes of class and chat with our learners. Have a conversation, maybe a different topic every day, what they did on the weekend, something that they particularly liked on television, something that relates to the unit, but also gives your learners a chance to tell you about themselves. That activity with adverbs of frequency is one of those. To be sure to offer a variety of types of projects with different products so that different learners, different teens will be able to find a project that they particularly want to do. We need to make them challenging and that they become more challenging over time. And perhaps the most important thing is we need to give them a choice. So why? Because choice inspires curiosity and creativity. It motivates learners because they have a sense of ownership. This is their project. It engages learners with different interests. It supports different learning styles, encourages collaboration and communication, and it enables learners with different English language proficiency to succeed. So we want to be thinking about having some projects that require less or more English proficiency depending upon the learners that are in our classes. So how do we provide choice? Well, first, they could work alone or in pairs or groups by offering different types of projects, by letting students suggest projects or modifying them. And again, that might be one of the things that you talk about in that 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of class. And then to provide different ways for students to share their projects. So here is just a broad array of different kinds of artistic and written projects. Especially, I wanted to do some of the writing because I know many of you were saying that your students do not like to write, but it might be because of what they're being asked to write. So here, they could create a comic strip about food waste. They could write a biography of a local artist. They could perform a skit about a natural disaster. They could write a news article about animals that have helped save human lives. They could do a biographical poster about a scientist who in this case discovered connections to our human origins, but to an archaeologist, a paleontologist, to any of the people who are doing very interesting work that maybe relates to our units. How about writing an advice column about a problem young people face? I think many of our learners would be motivated to do that. And then writing a blog entry about reducing our environmental footprint. If you think about the multiple intelligences, the 8 different learning styles that Howard Gardner talks about, there are projects for each one of these. For those of us who are particularly verbal, they could advertise that app, or they could write a blog about living in a place where it's light for more than 2 months. If they're very logical and very mathematical, they can do surveys, like about speech habits, and summarize the results. Or they can create a timeline. If they're very social, they can interview a classmate or a teacher about issues of identity and write a profile. They could hold an eco-friendly fashion show. Very personal learners, they can tell their own visual story. We talked about a photo autobiography, or they could talk about a cause or a person that's important to them. If they're kinesthetic learners and they're very active, they can perform a skit about teen lives in the past. They can hold an eco-friendly fashion show. Again, that would also be kinesthetic. Musical, They can interview classmates about favorite musicians, and I really like this one. They can discuss traditional instruments and find out ways they might be combined with modern music. They might even be able to actually record something. And if they're naturalists, if they're people who really like being outdoors, they can create a brochure for a conservation organization, write a news article on animals who have saved human lives, particularly things like dolphins or dogs who have helped in the military. Now, one of the problems that many people talk about with projects is that limited time that you have with your students. And so let me give you some suggestions on ways in which you can modify your projects so that there is enough time. First way is to simply eliminate one of the steps. For example, if students are going to have to use websites for their research, rather than having them find those, provide them with a list of those to use in their research. And if they need pictures or maps or places or other visuals, help them to locate these. That saves a lot of time and enables them to focus on what's most important. If it's an interview, reduce the number of individuals to interview. Or if it's a project, increase the number of students in a group so that there are different roles that people can play, and you can divide up the tasks and suggest roles. And here are some examples of some roles. A coordinator could keep everyone on track, make sure all the tasks are being done. Time manager can be making sure that the time is being allocated well. Resource manager makes sure that what is needed is available. A recorder takes notes and perhaps oversees the final project. And the presenter explains the project to the class, though in many cases, all might have some role of doing the presentation. Note that it's really critical to allow enough time for every project to be presented to the class. If you have a very large class, what you may want to do is break up the class into groups and have projects be presented to a smaller number. But everybody needs to have time to present their project, to answer questions, and to get feedback, because this is really the time in which they're sharing, in which they're very proud of what they've accomplished. These are just the steps to take in a project, from selecting a topic, planning the research and how you're going to present the results, doing the research, developing the product, sharing it and the results with others, reflecting on the experience. And here's a really important one, to also take the time to have each person evaluate themselves in terms of their roles in the project, and also for peers to actually evaluate the project. What did they learn from it? What are the things that they thought were best about it? And the teacher's role in projects is very, very different. In this case, we are not the sage on the stage. Our role is to facilitate, to monitor, to make sure students understand what they're doing, to help with language when needed, to provide access to information or resources, and to provide that time for them to share their final product or presentation. I've mentioned this earlier, but I want to emphasize this. When students are working on projects and they make language mistakes, do not take the time, don't interrupt, don't correct them, make a note of it, and then when the class comes back together, use that as a time to say, I've been hearing some problems that some of you are having with passive voice, or some of you are having with particular vocabulary words, and take that then as a time to review. But it's so critical. There's so much personal involvement in projects that we don't want to break up that time, and we don't want to make people uncomfortable. We want them to be confident and to feel successful and with whatever they produce. But we can then use what we've heard later on. So lots of benefits of projects. Encourage learner independence, which we're always trying to do. Promote critical thinking, provide way for teens to apply what they're learning, linking the class with the home and community, supporting learning that's going on in their other classes in science and history, to encourage creativity and communication, to make learning more enjoyable, to appeal to different learning styles and talents, and to bring real life into the classroom and bring the classroom to life. And of course, they should be fun. What are the benefits for language learning? Well, first, usually we have some activities before a project. The project then gives us a chance to build on those language activities and to actually become much more comfortable with the language. It requires authentic use of English. Most projects use all 4 skills: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Most projects connect the classroom with the wider world. bringing the world into the classroom and taking learners outside using language. They make learning meaningful and purposeful and challenge learners to use English in new ways. This is something that I think some of you may want to try. So often at the end of a unit, we give a quiz, and those can be so boring. How about if instead, at the end of a unit, you asked your learners to summarize the unit with a rap, or in groups to develop a song that summarized what the unit was about, using some of that vocabulary and grammar. Or they could write a news article or a news flash or report based on what it was that they learned. They could write an advertisement. They could write an advice column. This is just a very, I think, a much more interesting way to review and to summarize and to find out what your learners really learned than perhaps a traditional quiz, or at least in addition to. I wanted to actually end by asking you to write a rap, but we're not going to have enough time for that, I'm afraid. So, why projects? Because projects are knowledge in action. They involve less teaching, but they involve a lot more learning. And thank you. And here's my email address. I would love to have you email me with the kinds of projects that you're doing. If you've tried some of the ones that we talked about today, I'd love to hear about it. But I'd also like to know about some of the projects that you've been doing in your classes. So please, if you have the time, do please send me some information about how you're actually integrating projects in your language classrooms. And thanks. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions if you have any, or comments. I'm seeing a lot of thanks, and thank you very much for being with us. If there's anything that you would like to either share or a question, that would be fine. What about, if somebody asked, what about interdisciplinary projects? I think that's Farelina. Very, very good idea. I mean, if, for example, you're doing a survey on sleep habits, it's interdisciplinary, isn't it? Because you're talking about health, but you're also doing a survey which has some mathematical characteristics as well. If you're looking at ways in which we can reduce our environmental footprint, we're probably talking about science, but we're also talking about human behavior and psychology. So I think really a lot of projects are in fact interdisciplinary. Somebody asked how we might address differences in learning styles and ability with relation to 21st century skills. I think that probably you're going to find that almost any one of these projects is going to involve communication. It probably is going to involve creativity. Where there might be some difference would be collaboration. And if you have learners who are pretty independent learners, of course, you sometimes want them to collaborate, but they will often choose to do something personal and by themselves. And that's okay too. That's the reason for having choice, for having some projects that can be done alone, in pairs, or in groups. I think, does that answer your question, that you probably are going to, most of the time, involve at least 3 of the 4 21st century skills, the 4 C's. I see Emily is back on.
I'm back on. Thank you so much, Jodi. I think we can wrap up. And like Jodi said, if anyone has any questions, you can email her, or definitely email ngl.webinars@cengage.com, and we can get the question over to Jodi as well. So first off, thanks so much, Jodi, for the great webinar today and for sharing all of these project ideas for the TDH classroom with teachers around the world. And thank you all for joining us. I know it was very late in some places, so thanks so much for staying up, or if it's early in the morning, thanks for getting up for this. We're so happy you joined us today. Just a few closing remarks as we wrap up here. First off, several of the examples used today were from National Geographic Learning's Impact, and Jodi is actually a series editor for Impact. It's a 5-letter series for teenagers that helps them better understand themselves, each other, and the world they live in. To learn more about that, you can visit eltngl.com/impact to find out a little bit more about that series. And we will be sending everyone a certificate of attendance as well as the recording and the slides from the session. So you will be able to access all those great project ideas. That will come in about 5 days following the webinar. And the slides and recording will also be posted on our webinar archive. So you can look for them there too. And we'd love for you to join us for more webinars. We have one actually next week. And you can sign up on the site right here, eltngl.com/webinars. That's for actually teaching adults. It's about grammar structures. And then we do have a blog for learners of English, or for teachers of English, that we'd love for you to check out as well. Jodi does have some posts on there too. All right, and last but not least, if you haven't already, definitely connect with us on our social channels. We have a Facebook account and one for several regions, as well as a LinkedIn and a YouTube. So we'd love for you to connect with us and to share different ideas from your own classroom there. So, all right. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to direct you all to a survey now. And of course, if you have any questions, always email ngl.webinars@cengage.com. All right. Bye, everyone. Bye, Jodi.
Bye.